is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Without objection.
Speaker, I rise in support of S534, the Protecting Young Victims from Sexual Abuse Act. But I thank my colleagues here in the House, Congresswoman Brooks and Congresswoman Frankel of Florida. In Michigan, there was a volcanic action. One might call it the NASA volcano. It acted and there was no reaction. It was deadening silence. No one responded to the volcano that kept pouring poisonous lava in the way of young, beautiful athletes. I would hope and wish that I was not on the floor today with my colleague from Texas, having to discuss this life-changing experience for these young athletes who wanted to do nothing else but to make their families proud first, maybe exceed and be able to adhere to their faith of determination and resolve, and make their nation, their state, their school proud of them. Young girls, women, who heretofore, Mr. Speaker, have been held back or told that this sport was not for you. I'm reminded of the women's hockey team. And I heard a young hockey player indicate that a grandmother said that hockey was not for girls. All they want to do was to make us proud. All they wanted to do is to show the strength of women and the resolve of women. That's why I think this bill not only is important, Mr. Speaker, but it is timely to come today, but all of us would have wished, with no condemnation, that we had it 5 years ago or 10 years ago. But remember what I said. The volcanic action was faced with deafening silence for those who knew. And for the girls who wanted to make us proud, they thought that the best way to resolve it or to handle it was to embrace it, accept it, suffer, and still make us proud. That's why I believe this bill is crucial, and I'm very glad to be on the floor with the two House sponsors, and I thank Senator Feinstein for her efforts, because this bill would prevent the sexual abuse of minors and amateur athletes by requiring the prompt reporting of sexual abuse to law enforcement authorities. This is a reasonable and important measure that is intended to protect young athletes and listen to the sound of the volcano from abuse and preserve the sanctity of sports associated with the U.S. Olympic Committee, the organization responsible for preparing and training young athletes who might one day represent our nation competitively all over the world. How proud we are as we sit and view them, the nation's televisions, the Summer Olympics and the Winter Olympics that are about to start. How shameful it is that we have to have this legislation to protect them, and as well the deadening silence at the University of Michigan with Dr. Nasser, and I guess the only words that he could say is how ashamed and embarrassed and sorry he is. And eons and eons and eons of young women now live with that pain. Children deserve to fully enjoy the innocence of their youth by exploring the curiosities of the world, taking pleasure in the arts, participating in sports free of abuse. And yes, I'm going to defend the parents. I know some of them are overly eager. We've seen them at the Little League, and we've seen them at the football competition for little ones and middle school and high school, and they're overly enthusiastic. You can't condemn a parent for being proud of their child. And if that child wants to be engaged in sports, you can't condemn that parent for trying to get them the best doctor and best instructor. And those parents were not protected. Deafening silence. Sexual abuse of children and youth is an abhorrent practice that is intolerable in any context, and we must take appropriate measures to eliminate it from youth sports. Young people look to adults to protect them and keep them safe. We all have a responsibility to do so. With S534, we have an opportunity to ensure that individuals abide by this duty. Certain other professionals, such as doctors, dentists, social workers, psychologists, teachers, and daycare workers, are already bound by law to report suspected abuse to law enforcement. Finally, S534 will require the same of adults who interact with young athletes in connection with sports activities organized by the national governing bodies of various sports. The urgent need for this legislation is best illustrated by the horrible abuse and exploitation of numerous young gymnasts at the hands of Dr. Larry Nassar, who victimized young athletes participating in USA Gymnastics over the course of 20 years. 20 years, 2 decades. All of our hearts should break. And in those 20 years, there are lives ruined that will never be the vibrant, excited young woman that they were as they entered this wonderful experience of showing their prowess, their genius, and their strength. The stories of abuse and suffering of these young women are heartbreaking. Many complaints of sexual and emotional abuse by Nassar and others went unreported for years, allowing coaches, instructors, and doctors to repeatedly victimize gymnasts as young as 6 years old. The shocking failure of anyone to report accusations to law enforcement or even keep track of complaints internally made it impossible for some of these predators to commit multiple horrific acts over time. We entrust the care of our children and young athletes to those we hope will uphold the trust and not abuse it. One of the more than 150 girls and women victimized by Dr. Nassar was recently quoted as saying, "He has everything he needs to be an incredible leader. He has the personality, the skill, the knowledge, and he's using it to prey on people. What a waste." Last week, a Michigan judge sentenced Nassar to a prison sentence of up to 175 years. The judge called Nassar's assaults on scores of girls and women under the pretense that he was treating them as precise, calculated, manipulative, devious, and despicable. She also indicated what a debasing human being he was and is. We must continue to do more to help protect our young athletes, and this bill will greatly assist in that effort. However, I must note a concern with the change the bill has that was made before us that would make to the Senate passed version of 534. The bill unanimously passed by the Senate would authorize funding to be provided to the U.S. Center for Safe Sport in the amount of $1 million for each of the next 4 years. Unfortunately, the version of the bill before us strips this funding authorization. I believe we should have taken up the Senate bill without amendment. Safe Sport is charged with important responsibilities under this bill with respect to receiving and investigating all allegations of abuse and setting policies to prevent future abuse. So this bill has taken out that language in the Senate. It is critical that we ensure that the center is provided the resources for those things to be done immediately. By doing so, I hope we will prevent the type of abuse and suffering perpetrated by the people like Larry Nassar. In a recent open letter from the U.S. Olympians and Paralympians Association, athletes everywhere, they wrote, "The goal of Olympianism is to place sport at the service of the harmonious development of humankind, womankind, with a view to promoting a peaceful society concerned with the preservation of human dignity. Now we must ask, how can athlete dignity be preserved when the responsible institutions fail so in their oversight?" In an apology letter to Team USA from the United States Olympic Committee issued last week, the committee admitted that they had failed its young athletes. Frankly, I believe that whole committee and system should be overhauled, reviewed, inspected, and changed. While the U.S. gymnastics scandal is unfortunate, let it be an example and incentive to prevent such abuse from happening in the nooks and crannies of this nation, in the villages and cities and counties where young people that are starry-eyed and ready to accept the leadership of an adult are ready to show their proudness and as well their talent, their strength, and their resolve. I hope that we'll never end that here in America. Accordingly, I encourage my colleagues to join me in supporting this important legislation, and I hope we will see fit to fund it, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlelady reserves the balance for time. Gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Speaker, appreciate the comments of my friend from Texas. Just so it's clear, I agree with you on the money. Should have been funded, but it was ruled an earmark. And we can't do earmarks anymore, so we have to go through another process to get that funding. Good reason why we ought to have earmarks. Mr. Speaker, I'll yield myself 30 seconds.
Gentleman's recognized.
Amanda Barteron. Here's what she said at the sentencing hearing. I refuse to let Larry Nassar take anything more from me. He's already taken enough. Nicole Walker. Here's what she said at the sentencing hearing. I have anxiety and sleep disorders all because of what you, Nassar, did to me. And, Mr. Speaker, I'll now yield 3 minutes to the gentlelady from Indiana, Ms. Brooks, a former U.S. attorney.
Gentlelady is recognized for 3 minutes.
I thank the gentleman from Texas for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of this legislation, Senate Bill 534. I also want to thank my colleague from the other side of the aisle, co-chair of the Women's Caucus that I co-chair, Representative Lois Frankel of Florida, for helping me get this bill to this point and helping us support Senator Feinstein and Senator Thune as they move the bill in the Senate. In less than 2 weeks, over 200 American athletes will represent our nation at the highest levels of sport in the 2018 Olympic Winter Games in Pyeongchang. These athletes have prepared their entire lives for these games, and their performances are a result of countless hours of practice, self-discipline, and sacrifice. Tragically, we've also learned that many of our young athletes have been subjected to sexual abuse at the hands of those who were supposed to be supporting them reach their Olympic goals. We've seen more than 156 women use their voices to share their agonizing stories of sexual abuse at the hands of a doctor they and their parents were told to trust, Dr. Larry Nassar. Their decision to publicly reveal their traumatic experiences is nothing short of heroic, and was instrumental in ensuring that Nassar will never again touch another young athlete. Now, after a 2016 Indianapolis Star investigation exposed what is now known as the worst sexual abuse scandal in athletics to date, we are taking action to prevent this heinous action from ever taking place again. Today, the House will vote on Protecting Young Victims from Sexual Abuse and Safe Sport Authorization Act of 2017. This bipartisan legislation mandates training, increases requirements for reporting abuse, and reforms a broken system that has failed too many victims. This bill requires any individual who interacts with our amateur athletes to report suspected child abuse, including sexual abuse, within 24 hours. If they fail to do so, they'll be held accountable by the new law. To prevent future emotional, physical, and sexual abuse, this bill designates the United States Center for Safe Sport to develop, implement, and enforce policies, procedures, and mandatory training for national governing bodies and their members. The center will ensure that when reports of abuse are made, they are investigated. It protects those who report abuse from retaliation. And as common sense would dictate, it requires that until the investigation is closed, an adult who is subject to allegations of abuse against a minor is prohibited from interacting with minors. As the Nassar sentencings come to a close and the Olympic Games quickly approach, we are reminded of the importance of protecting the safety and well-being of all of our athletes. Today, we are strengthening protections for victims to ensure transparency and accountability, and putting the safety and the health of our athletes and every young athlete who has ever dreamed of the Olympic stage first. I thank the gentleman for consideration of this bill and urge my colleagues to pass the Senate bill. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back her time. Gentleman from Texas reserves his time. Gentlelady from Texas.
Mr. Speaker, it's my pleasure to yield 3 minutes to the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Frankel, the original co-sponsor of the House bill, and thank her for her leadership on these issues. I yield the gentlelady 3 minutes.
For 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank Mr. Poe and Ms. Johnson for leading this debate today, and of course, Ms. Jackson Lee, and I, of course, want to thank Susan Brooks, my co-chair of the Women's Caucus. This is an example of bipartisanship at the best, and of course, Dianne Feinstein over in the Senate, whose bill we're taking up, our companion bill. Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of the Protecting Young Victims from Sexual Abuse and Safe Sport Authorization Act. It's a long name, but it's important. It came about on the heels of reports of sexual abuse at the highest levels of the USA Gymnastics. Me Too has come to the Olympics. And we've heard from more than 150 very brave young women, extraordinary not only in their talent, but in their courage, who have shared their harrowing stories of sexual abuse at the hands of a doctor, Larry Nassar, who they were told to trust. One of these stories is from Maddie Larson, who was a budding young gymnast and a future Olympic medalist. At age 14, she hurt her hip and was sent to Dr. Nassar, the well-known and now disgraced doctor who cared for hundreds of athletes like Maddie. Instead of healing her hip, he crippled her mind. For 5 years, this doctor molested this young woman. As she became so desperate at one point that she feigned a slip and fall and a concussion just to try to get out of ever going back to the Olympic facility. Maddie said, "I just couldn't take it anymore, any more abuse. I was broken. Larry, my coaches, and USA Gymnastics turned the sport I fell in love with as a kid into my personal living hell." These children, they're children like Maddie, who want to represent our country and give up so much of their childhood, getting up early, practicing hard on weekends, going to competitions, and then only to be subjected to sexual abuse by the team doctor and then either ignored or encouraged to keep silent. And I say, shame, shame, shame on those who enabled this. It may be too late to protect Maddie and stars, Olympic stars like Ali Reisman, but this legislation, by requiring prompt reporting and oversight procedures, will protect our future young athletes. And I urge my colleagues to support this very, very good bipartisan legislation. And, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back her time. Gentlelady from Texas reserves her time. Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Poe.
Mr. Speaker, Catherine Gordon said this at the sentencing: "Sexual assault is distant until you realize each girl in the news is a broken mirror." And now we yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Bishop.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of S-534, the Protecting Young Victims from Sexual Abuse Act of 2018. I thank the gentleman from Texas for giving me this opportunity to speak. Mr. Speaker, last week was a tough week in my district and our country. In a courtroom in Lansing, Michigan, 156 victims, one by one, bravely faced depraved sexual predator Larry Nassar to recount their personal story of unimaginable and despicable atrocities. As we now know, reports of sexual misconduct were routinely dismissed or flatly ignored by the management of USA Gymnastics. As a direct result, hundreds of young women, all of whom relied on these trusted professionals, all around them, were sexually assaulted under the guise of medical treatment. The court did its part this week and sentenced Nassar to a prison term, a maximum prison term, where he will spend the rest of his life. But the investigation continues and others will be held accountable in the days to come. On our part, during this process, members of Congress must do everything in their power to ensure that this never happens again. With that as our objective, I believe this bill takes a dramatic step in the right direction. Now, I must say, in all candor, I stand before you today in absolute disbelief. Disbelief in the layers of mismanagement that should have prevented this from happening. But also disbelief that it takes an act of Congress to ensure a congressionally chartered organization fulfill its obligation to care for and protect the young athletes with whom their parents have entrusted. Mr. Speaker, I would like to join my constituents in offering our heartfelt prayers to the victims and their families for the nightmare that they have experienced. To all of you, please know my colleagues and I will do everything in our power to be your strong advocate and to ensure justice. I urge all members to advocate and support this legislation. With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Mr. Poe reserves his time. Gentlelady from Texas.
Does the gentleman have any other speakers?
Yes. I have one more speaker besides myself to close.
Let me yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentlelady is recognized.
As we've listened to various speakers, I'm glad that we're joined by men and women of the United States Congress, and all of us have indicated the sadness in which we do this now. But I think it is also important to take note of the fact of individuals who have to be held responsible. We know that the president of the university was asked to resign, or in fact has resigned. And as we go forward, there'll be others as well. This should be the clarion call, even as this legislation is passed and signed by the president, for all of these agencies and associations that run sports for children to do their own vetting and internal assessment of individuals who are not there for the benefit of children, but are there for the benefit of themselves. 156 women plus was molested by this doctor. And one of the victims said something that stops your breath. This could have been stopped in 1997, more than 20 years ago. So this legislation should move swiftly to the president's desk. And with that, I yield. I reserve my time.
Gentlelady reserves the balance of her time. The gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Paulson.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. I thank the gentleman for his leadership, as well as the author, Ms. Brooks, for her leadership on this issue. Mr. Speaker, members, I rise today in support of the Protecting Young Victims from Sexual Abuse Act. In the wake of the horrendous revelations of sexual abuse brought to the forefront by the recent USA Gymnastics case, it is clear that measures do need to be put in place to protect young athletes and keep them safe. There is no child that ever should be put in the position of having their innocence robbed from them, which is why we need to have the highest protections of the law from those looking to exploit them and take advantage of their vulnerability. I would encourage my colleagues to join me in supporting this bipartisan bill, which will require amateur athletic governing bodies to immediately report sex abuse allegations to local or federal law enforcement, and also to make it safe and easy for victims to report that abuse. As the Olympics approach, there's no doubt we will all be reminded, unfortunately, of the recent sexual abuse case that took place with the gymnastics team. But this is our opportunity, members, to take action, to do everything in our power to make sure that this does not happen again, and to protect all our young and future athletes, giving them the confidence that they will never be put in a situation where an adult or someone who may have inappropriate intentions does not have the ability to do so. And with that, I yield back. Thank you for the time.
Gentleman yields back his time. Gentleman from Texas reserves his time. Gentlelady from Texas.
Again, does the gentleman have any further speakers?
I'm ready to close.
With that, then I will close. Thank you so very much. When I read the quote from the accuser that said this could have been stopped in 1997, the article's headline is that 8 times Larry Nassar could have been stopped. 8 times. So it's important to take note of this legislation as a clarion call. And these words are most important. And again, I ask to consume such time as I might consume.
Gentlelady's recognized.
Thank you.
This provision makes it unlawful for an adult who is authorized by a national governing body, a member of a national governing body, or an amateur sports organization that participates in interstate or international amateur athletic competition to interact with a minor or amateur athlete at specific events to fail to report as soon as possible child and sexual abuse to local law enforcement or another agency. Many times, members of the Judiciary Committee don't like wide nets. We have a responsibility to adhere to the Constitution. But we are, as well, the committee that has the responsibility of upholding the rule of law. And to all of those who are now in this wide net, that is the rule of law, to be able to protect our children against massive sexual abuse as they pursue their dreams. Just a comment. The requirement would arise on a person that learns of the facts that give reason to suspect that a child has suffered an incident of child abuse, including sexual abuse. And therefore, those who can say or attempt to say, I couldn't understand what the child was saying, it wasn't clear, but they got a sense that there was a problem, they come under that net. I believe that that is appropriate. Let me also indicate that there's a long list of sheroes that have been impacted by Dr. Nassar. My constituent stated on January 16th, the former Olympic gymnast who wowed the world, Simone Biles, said that she was abused by Dr. Nassar. The long list of Dr. Nassar's victims include U.S. Olympic gymnasts Michaela Maroney, Allie Reisman, and Gabby Douglas. They represented the country and made us proud, and can you imagine they were abused? Let me thank the many organizations that have worked hard to advance this legislation, including Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network, RAIN, the nation's largest anti-sexual violence organization. They have been magnificent. And I'd like to enter into the record a number of letters, Mr. Speaker, because each day approximately 600 individuals affected by sexual violence are served, most of whom are children or parents seeking support, and they're served by this organization.
Objection.
Let me introduce into the record, Mr. Speaker, the letter supporting this legislation from RAIN, which urges the House of Representatives and others to pass this legislation so that it can move quickly into the position to be signed by the President.
Without objection, so ordered.
Every 2 minutes in America, someone is sexually assaulted. Every 8 minutes, that individual is a child. And thank you. Let me add from the U.S. Olympians and Paralympians, and I would like to call their names. These are all athletes: Dick Fosbury, track and field; Willie Banks, track and field; Allison Baver, speed skating; Carol Brown, rowing; Candace Cable, Paralympic track and field; Karen Davis, rowing; Gary Hall Sr., swimming; Mickey King, diving; Carol Lewis, track and field; John Neighbor, swimming; Bill Tomey, track and field; Iris Zimmerman. Ask unanimous consent.
Without objection.
Likewise, a letter dated the 24th. I think these are all the same. Letter from the CWLA, Child Welfare League of America, who worked on this issue. Ask unanimous consent to submit theirs into the record.
Without objection.
The D.C. Coalition Against Domestic Violence that has worked along with RAIN and as well has emphasized that the nation's youngest have been impacted by this dastardly series of actions. Ask unanimous consent.
Without objection.
A letter from Professor Emeritus from DePaul University, Mr. Howard Rubin, who speaks about the sexual abuse. My wife, Barbara Blaine, knew the lasting damage that is caused when a child is abused, having been a child victim, and he asks that his support for this be submitted into the record.
Without objection.
The National Children's Alliance that has been working with other advocacy groups, and again, long-standing work against child abuse, supporting this legislation. Ask unanimous consent.
Without objection.
And Child USA, Let's End Child Abuse and Neglect, this bill would shine much needed sunlight on the problem of abuse in sports. It will protect children in the future. I ask unanimous consent.
Without objection.
Finally, Mr. Speaker, I want to thank Mr. Poe for his longstanding work on these issues, the two House co-sponsors and the Senator, and I want to end with that volcano, that volcanic action, and there was no reaction, but deadening silence. Let us, with the passage of this bill, begin the journey of commitment, along with our acknowledgement of the Me Too movement, that we will never be silent again. With that, I ask support of the legislation and yield back.
Gentlelady yields back her time. Gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself the remainder of the time.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the gentlelady from Texas and for her support of the legislation, but also her long time working on these issues of victims of crime and her involvement in legislation in the past and in the future on matters such as this. This is not a happy event, Mr. Speaker. This legislation, as Mr. Bishop said, it's unfortunate that Congress has to get involved in this issue. And Congress is going to get involved. And we're going to try to rectify the problems of the past and hold people accountable for crimes in the future. But we are talking about the symbol of everything that's good and right and beautiful about America, these Olympics, the Olympians, and particularly the gymnasts that represent America, the training they go through, the zeal for which they represent our country and work. And yet, while all of that was going on, bad things were happening to them. And our gymnasts that just participated in the last Olympics, who won medals, gold medals, they endured abuse, but yet they went forward to represent our country in the United States Olympics. And people who harm those girls and other athletes, male and female, they need to be held accountable. Not just Larry Nassar, but other people need to be held accountable. This is where law enforcement needs to be involved. You know, I'm a former judge, you know that, and I want to commend the judge in this case, Judge Rosemary Aquilina, for allowing all of these victims to testify in open court, the courage to come forward and tell very difficult things that are so difficult for us to even listen to here on the House floor. And they said it, and they wanted the criminal to know what he had done to them impacted them. So I want to congratulate the judge for allowing that, but also the sentence that she imposed. I want to read a few more of the statements, Mr. Speaker. Jessica Rodriguez. USA Gymnastics should be held accountable for each and every one of these acts of abuse they allowed to happen. Taryn Look. I was still a child. I wanted to end my life. Maddie Larson. I was at the height of my career at 19, and the Olympics were just a year away, and I just couldn't take any more of the abuse. I was broken. Larry, my coaches, and USA Gymnastics turned the sport I fell in love with as a kid to my personal living hell. Mr. Speaker, all of these brave Americans came forward and testified about what had happened to them. And we should, they're all Olympians for that. They all deserve the gold medal for what they did represented our country. And their strength and their courage to testify in open court about what happened to them. The defendant, the criminal, the convicted criminal, wrote a letter to the judge, Mr. Speaker, saying he couldn't take all of this abuse against him for having to listen to all of the statements by the victims. Are you kidding me? He's not the victim. He's the criminal. And he belongs in jail. He belongs in jail, as these victims have said, for the rest of his life, to keep him away from little girls. And I'm glad that that's where he is going, but he is not a victim. His mental abuse, his mental abuse that he occurred or caused on victims of crime, he needs to remember what he had done. And I'm glad that we have finally got this legislation passed in such a quick method. It's a proof, Mr. Speaker, we can work pretty fast, and we also can work in a bipartisan, and we can also work with the Senate, getting legislation that's important to America passed. I want to read one last statement. And I ask unanimous consent, Mr. Speaker, to introduce into the record the 133 written statements that I have, subject to length limitation in the record.
Without objection.
Here's what Natalie Woodard said. I am strong, I am beautiful, I am bold, and no one, especially you, Nasser, can take that away from me. And while standing up here, I realize that I am not alone. And she's not alone. We're on her side. We should be on the side of victims of crime. And this legislation will promote a better atmosphere, a lawful, a good atmosphere for our gymnasts and other athletes to work in. And the people who committed these crimes need to be held accountable. And society has started with the first culprit, Larry Lecherous Nasser. And there should be more to follow. And that's just the way it is, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. All time has expired. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass Senate Bill 534 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is passed, and with that, gentleman from Texas.
Nays.
Yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having arisen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question will be postponed.